thank you all so much for being here. I'm just so surprised that there's anybody here on a Thursday night. I don't know how I got on a program with Irv Grossbeck and Dean Joss and Jim Van Horn and all the other luminaries that are on this. And I agonized a little bit over, what should I do? What should I say to just kind of, impart anything that would be worth you spending an hour of your time. And as I started thinking about it, I thought, great athletes visualize what success would be. And so I started to think about, what would it really feel like and, to do a good job here tonight. And I remembered a story about Judge Learned Hand, who's probably the greatest American jurist who never was appointed to the U.S. Supreme Court. And one day they asked Judge Hand what a perfect day would be like for him. And he said, well, I'd wake up late, I'd have breakfast in bed, I'd be carried into the stadium to cheers of my arrival. After the festivities, I would go and have a leisurely bath, and then that evening be driven to an elegant dinner party where would be assembled all of the great minds of all time. And part of the way through the dinner party, the crowning moment would come when somebody would stand up and say, "Shut up, Voltaire. We want to listen to Learned Hand." And so my version of this is tonight you'll say, we want to stay late on Thursday night and listen to Joel Peterson. This idea of a last lecture, as I understand it, came up in around the 1960s and was pioneered at Brandeis University. And the idea there was that they would ask people to come and give a talk as if it were the last opportunity they would ever have to speak to a group of students. I was so inspired by this idea that I started one of these last lecture series at my alma mater. And I found that the people that we invited would do one of two things. They would either do like Jim Van Horn just did and speak about something where they had world-class knowledge. I recall inviting Dr. Henry Eyring, who was a world-class chemist, and he spoke about the dancing molecules, and they came alive. And it was really interesting to see people with a passion for their area of expertise. And then others really were more literal. They just said, what if you really were never going to talk to these people again? What would you want to tell them? What would you want them to know? And so that's kind of what I've decided to do tonight, is really be literal about this. What would I tell you if this were the last chance? One of the students asked me tonight before I came in here, well, are you going to talk about real estate or private equity investing? And I'm not going to talk about either one of those. In order to get you to pay attention to what I'm going to say, because you may laugh when I finally get to the topic after this long, labored introduction, I need to tell you my qualifications. The first one is luck. And I think MBA students would probably understand that best in terms of having made money one more time than I've lost it. And I hasten to add that we're only in the 7th inning there, and I've got partners that would say there's still plenty of time left for you to blow it again, and you have proven capacity. The second thing is experience. I've made a lot of mistakes. I've been on a number of boards, dozens of boards actually over the years, done a handful of startups, built projects all over the world, have borrowed billions of dollars and made the mistake of personally guaranteeing it, and then spent millions of dollars trying to recover a fragment of what those billions of dollars had built. And probably the most relevant experience I've had is that I'm the father of 7 kids. And that's probably the most managerially qualifying part of my whole experience. And the final is a certain amount of cunning. And I'll offer as proof of that cunning only one reference point. And that is that I've been able to convince my wife of 30 years to stick with me, proving half of what Abraham Lincoln said about you can fool some of the people all of the time. So you'll have other people here that will demonstrate. By the way, these are my 2 daughters coming in here, and I'm. Before I started tonight, I thought they would be the only friendly faces here. But I recognize a number of students from class here, so I'm actually more comfortable than I thought I'd be. So other people rely on intellect, speaking prowess, profound knowledge of a subject matter. I'm going to be relying on luck, battle scars, some ugly experiences, and limited street smarts. What I'm going to offer you tonight is a map, a fragment of a map. And it's a fragment of a map that's unique to territory I've traversed. It doesn't have much to do really with what you'll be doing, but I think it'll prove valuable to you. And let me tell you why. A few years ago, I was climbing Mount Kilimanjaro with a small party, and we were nervous about whether or not we were going to be able to make it to the summit. And we were talking about it. We knew it was high, and we'd had some good friends who'd been triathletes, who'd run in the Ironman, who'd not made it to the summit, and so we were talking about it when we ran into a couple of elderly British women coming in. They were in their late 60s, early 70s, and they told us about taking Diamox and how to acclimate and where to purify your water and how to climb volcanic scree and just all kinds of really helpful things. But the thing that was really helpful was the visual image of these 70-year-old women who had made it to the top. And we looked at each other and said, we can do this. You know, we're younger, we're in better shape, we've got better equipment. In the same way, by seeing me up here, you know that you will have no trouble making it up the hill. I'm younger than that guy, I'm better looking than that guy, I'm in better shape, I got better training. So this map is going to have some value to you. Now, as I started to sift through the detritus of the 55 years I've been around trying to do stuff, the most valuable thing to me was to talk to you about finding happiness in life. And I recall when I was in school, about your age, I was thinking, you know, really, it's making money, it's getting power, it's fame or celebrity, it's having influence, it's gathering about me all those things that will measure my success. I've since come to the point of, and I'll put a slide up here because I've referenced it, by using a quote from a fellow by the name of Friedrich Buechner, who says that human happiness is a function of discovering the person you are to be, someone to love, and a work to do. And so I'm going to organize my thoughts on happiness kind of around that quote. Let me make one comment about happiness before I jump into this. By the way, most of what I'm going to talk about tonight, because this is the Stanford Business School, will have to do with the work you have to do. But it really wouldn't be fair of me not to make a couple of comments about the first two. This is like a three-legged stool in the end. And if you only get 2 out of the 3 right, you will not find ultimate contentment in your life, in my experience. So let me now make a brief comment about this kind of continuum of well-being. You can decide where you want to be on this continuum. I think this talk will be more or less relevant wherever you decide you'd like it to be, other than maybe the pleasure end of it, which infants get by getting a bottle, and you get by just sort of immediate physical pleasure. If you were the kinds of people for whom that were the most important thing, we would not be sitting here in the Bishop Auditorium tonight. You would be in Las Vegas or something else. So I'm not too concerned about that. But I think that's the first comment. Now, let's start talking a little bit about each of these. First, let me say something about discovering the person you are to be, and give a couple of thoughts on sort of practical ways you might go about that. It was Goethe who said that if you want to be somebody, you have to, or if you want to accomplish something, you must first be something. So it really starts out with being somebody. There are 4 ways that I'd like to suggest that you think about discovering, self-discovery. The first way is a pretty obvious one, that is to read. And I don't mean business cases, although tomorrow morning I would appreciate it if my S355 class would read their business case. or finance journals or things like that. I mean read broadly. Read biographies. Read about other countries. Read books by people with completely different perspectives from your own. Read things by people who disagree fundamentally with you. If you read a book a year and then do the real estate calculation on how much that binding would cover, you'll find that at the end of your life, you'll really only be able to cover the walls of about a 10 by 10 foot cell. So it's a pretty small little abode that you're papering with whatever you decide to read. You will, in a significant degree, become what you think about in life, and you will think about what you read. Don't limit the person you are to be by reading only newspapers, only magazines, only professional journals. Read broadly. The second thing that I would suggest you consider is memorizing stuff that means something to you. I remember reading about the POWs who survived in Vietnam, and the ones who did the best were ones who had something that they could recall and think about. And if you do decide to commit things to memory, pay attention to what it is you decide to commit. If I take off the top of my stack, you'd hear things like, out of the night that covers me, black as a pit from pole to pole, I thank whatever gods may be for my unconquerable soul. Sweet are the uses of adversity. When it's darkest, men see the stars. The stronger the wind, the stronger the tree. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil. Well, what does that tell you about me? What does it tell me about me? You know, is that I've had to really think about this whole issue of adversity and overcoming odds and things like that. And as I thought about that, I said, where does this come from? And I remember when I was 10 years old, playing in a Little League baseball game and being assigned to right field while the pitcher walked in 24 runs. And I was out there for a couple of hours. Not a ball ever. Well, I went back home to my dad and said, I'm quitting. I do not want any more of this. And he said, Petersons never quit. And that thing somehow got cranked into my DNA at an early age, and I've been suffering from it ever since. And I was telling my group the other day that I'm like the Black Knight in the Monty Python skit who has his arms and legs cut off. It says, it's only a flesh wound. But pay a lot of attention to what it is you choose to memorize, because you'll get an insight into who you are. The third thing I would suggest is write out a mission statement. You would not finance a business without a business statement, nor would you start a business without creating a business statement. And yet, most of you are willing to go through life without thinking through a statement of philosophy, values, goals, etc. And I'm not going to bore you with the details, but my wife and I 30 years ago put together a family philosophy. And from this, we developed a regimen that all of our kids had to do, which ended up in them learning languages, learning to play instruments, going on survival camps. I mean, a lot of misery. We found out a whole lot about who we were, what our values were. It was really very self-revealing for us to go through this. And, of course, our kids are messes now, but we know each other and know our values. A year ago, we gave copies of this family philosophy to our married kids, and I'll bet you anything that there's a whole new generation that will be tormented by this. The final advice I would have for you in discovering who you are to be, and I don't want this to appear morbid, but go to a funeral every year and pay attention to what they say about the deceased, what is valued in their life, and then think about, and if you want to, write your own obituary. I've done this a couple of times, and once you get over the idea of it, it's amazing to realize what you have not become that you would really like to be said about yourself. It forces you to think about your legacy and what's important. And so I think if you'll do those things, which are to read, attempt to write out a life plan, memorize and pay attention to what you've done, and then reflect on the legacy you'll leave, you'll approach what Socrates had engraved above the door at the Temple of Delphi, which was, know thyself. Having thoughtfully considered that ancient admonition, you'll have begun to attach the first leg of this stool. Now the second one, and I won't dwell on this one too much either, because it's uncomfortable a lot of times for people in business schools to talk about things like love, but think in terms of words like approbation, approval, validation, whatever words make you feel comfortable. The first way to develop this second leg of the tripod that'll support your happiness in the long term in life is to realize that love is a function of sacrifice. In general, we love what we pay a big price for. I've often wondered if that isn't the reason behind the tuition here at the GSB. As second years, or even at the end of your first year, you really should be feeling the love by now. I had a good friend in college who claimed that he had always wanted a son, and he was just so excited when his son was born, and he was surprised that he not only didn't feel a real love and a real bond with this child, but he actually kind of resented that his wife was so distracted and that his sleep was interrupted. And that was really his take on this whole thing. And then his wife got sick. And she was sick for quite a while and pretty seriously ill. So it became his job to deal with the midnight feedings, the messy diapers, and the unrelenting demands of a helpless little boy. And by magic, as he reports it, over time he found this bond developing. Based on this sacrifice that was made, it has grown and developed, of course, into an unbreakable and lifelong connection. The lesson in this is sacrifice for that which you would love. The second one is make a commitment to somebody who doesn't deserve it. Recently, my wife and I began working with a violent convicted felon to whom we were assigned in some volunteer work that we're doing. And we have come to really and genuinely care about this fellow. And it's really not because he's so lovable. It's really because we were assigned and we made a commitment and we just kept doing it. Now, I know this flies in the face of everything we're taught in business school about maximizing returns on time and money. But I am really confident, at least in this last lecture series, that were I never to talk to you again, I would say that there is some perverse economy of spirit that makes it so that those who give benefit more than the intended beneficiaries. So make some irrational gifts to people of time and energy and care. Now, before I give an unqualified recommendation to this particular strategy, I have to ask if any of you have seen this play, 1,000 Clowns. Anybody aware of that? Oh, good. I'm so glad. You need to see this. Isn't it fabulous? They used to play it every year at Harvard at exam time, and everybody would take exam week and go see 1,000 Clowns again. It's this irreverent 1950s play about the world of work. The movie stars Jason Robards and Martin Balsam. And in any event, there's a young social worker named Sandy in the film who says that, she was starting to work with this young boy named Raymond Ledbetter. And she didn't like Raymond Ledbetter because she didn't understand him. Then she spent some time with Raymond Ledbetter. And after 3 weeks of time with Raymond Ledbetter, she understood him. And now she hated him. The world is full of Raymond Ledbetters, and you may run into them, and they may be testing you. More likely than not, they don't feel they deserve to be loved. My advice would be, when you can, occasionally care about them anyway. I'll bet you if you think back on your own life, you'll realize that there's been somebody who has had an irrational care for you. And so it's something that will allow you to develop this ability to love, which is the second part of building this stable stool. The final approach to that is don't allow grudges and bitterness, anger, desire for retribution to reside in you. And I have to tell you a personal story here, because it's really the way I have probably learned this the best. I spent several years in litigation, and it was brutal, eviscerating litigation. I spent 14 days in videotape deposition, dozens of hearings, millions of dollars with lawyers. I mean, it was really miserable. And I walked into the courtroom to face my accusers. And the first time I saw them, I mean, the testosterone was pumping. And I think I really despised these people for what they had done. And my wife perceived this alarming level of animus. And she reached over and grabbed me by the arm and said, think about the good times that we had with these people. Reflect on the wonderful things they did for us. And then this was the killer. She said, now show them that we love them. Well, I mean, how would you respond? I was just, it just seemed like such utter nonsense to me. And I really wanted to lash out at her to begin with. But I really wanted to just instruct her how justified my fury really was. Today, though, I really see wisdom in that, because I know that had I allowed my bitterness to fester and joint venture with their anger and the things that they had done, I would today be a far lesser person. So if you would know love in your life, you must also not give refuge to bitterness. Okay, now I'm going to move us to this this third area, which is the work to do, and really focus on that, because that's what you're here for. And let's see if I can pull this off. So being, we've talked about being, we've talked about loving, and now working. The final key to finding happiness is finding a work that you feel passion for and that you can do effectively and efficiently. I'm going to focus tonight on the work of leaders, because that's why you've come to business school. It's what it's preparing you to be. Overarching your eventual success as a leader is an attitude that you must have. And I think you need to be grateful for the opportunity to be a leader. A lot of people seek leadership for the wrong reasons, and there are a lot of people who do it poorly because of that. I was fortunate to work with a guy for 20 years who was a terrific person who used to say virtually every week, if not every day, work is more fun than fun. And that kind of an attitude brought to leadership is infectious, and it will really change. So start with that. Now let's talk specifics. In my experience, there are 4 things that leaders have to do and do well to be successful. And they have to do with pathfinding, team building, communicating, and being a person that others can trust. Those are really the 4 categories. And I know all kinds of people talk about leadership, and they group the activities different ways. But I'm going to talk just very briefly about being a pathfinder and a team builder, and then really spend some time on these last 2, which I think are the most difficult, the most critical, and the most likely to let you find real meaning in your work and therefore happiness in your life. Pathfinding. To be a pathfinder, or to be an effective leader, you have to define a definition and define mileposts along the way. The one mistake that I think young leaders make is to confuse the path with the goal. They work so hard at creating the path that they become committed to the path. And if you'll actually stay focused on your values and on your objectives and share those with the team that you've got, they'll help you rewrite the path. They'll redraw it for you, and you'll have a lot of help in that. The second one, on being a team builder, it includes, of course, hiring, promoting, rewarding, structuring compensation, and yes, firing. Some advice here. First of all, hire for brains and heart. A lot of people hire for experience, and there are times when that's important, but my experience is you can give people responsibility. With responsibility, they will get experience, and if they have brains and heart, they will turn that experience into wisdom, which is, after all, the ability to predict outcomes and influence outcomes in a proper way. So, you're not going to have very much ability to influence raw intelligence, and their character was probably formed at their mother's knee. You're not going to have much opportunity to do much there. So that's how I would counsel you to hire if you would be an effective leader. If you're going to terminate, and you will need to terminate people, my advice is to do it sooner rather than later. Do it quickly. Do it humanely. People rarely get better at stuff. And I hate to say that because I want the others so much. You really want to help them get there, but my experience is there's a big market out there. There are a lot of opportunities, and your job is to help people find their highest and best use, to use a real estate term. When you give feedback to people that are on your team, remember the 4-to-1 rule. And that is that if people receive negative feedback, it will take four pieces of positive feedback for them to consider it even. Somehow we just register, we're just all sensitive, and we just really register the negative feedback more than the positive. So remember that one. There really are very few things that you'll do that will leverage you more. If you learn how to hire right, reward right, terminate properly, and give proper feedback, you will find your ability as a leader will be leveraged manyfold. Okay, now let's get into the two that I want to spend most of the time on, which are being an effective communicator and being trustworthy. These are really tough. Now, on being an effective communicator, first of all, you're all experts in it. You've been communicating since you were born. We all speak and write and chat and listen and walk around, and we communicate all day long, every day, within teams that we work and externally to the market. So we're experts at that. You couldn't stop communicating if you wanted to. But there are 5 ways that you communicate, and you can become dramatically more effective as a leader in each of these 5 ways. We'll touch on those in just one second. Secondly, your ability to be trusted depends on 3 things, and those are having character, being competent, and being empowered to carry through on what you promise. Trust is built, it's like a building is built on a foundation, and that foundation is rooted in bedrock. Trust is the bedrock in which the foundation is built. You've got to be rooted in trust. It is very hard to build. It is easy to destroy, and it's almost impossible to repair. So this issue of trust, being a leader and engendering trust, is a really big one. And while you communicate all day long, you may not be as expert in the development and maintaining of trust as you are in communicating. Okay, let's talk about communicating. First of all, I think there are 2 things in communicating. The first one is have something to say. There should be substance in your analysis, meaning in your message, recognition of the implications of words and actions. In other words, make sure the beef is there, and then prepare. Do you remember Henry Kissinger used to get up in front of the press corps at his press conferences and say, do you have any questions for my answers? He prepared, he had something to say and he knew what it was. Most of you are really pretty good at this, and all of you will get better with experience. The second part, though, is communicating it effectively, and here's where the 5 ways you communicate comes in. Writing, speaking, listening, behaving, and this specialized form of communication, which we call negotiation. First of all, writing. I'll offer some suggestions here. Write short memos. Use short words. Use short sentences. Think of The Economist, which is one of the best written periodicals, which deals with very complex and difficult subjects. The average sentence in The Economist is 16 words. Get to the point. Recognize that most people do not like to read. Start with your conclusion. Support it with a couple of examples or 2 or 3 or 4 of your analyses, your arguments. People can't remember much more than that. Shakespeare said, brevity is the soul of wit. Don't forget that. Think about it. The Pythagorean theorem is 24 words. Archimedes' principle, 67 words. Lincoln's Gettysburg Address, 289 words. The 10 Commandments are 179. Even the U.S. Declaration of Independence is only 1,300 words. It's the really important stuff, like the alternative minimum tax that require really long paragraphs and really big words. So learn to write in a compressed, efficient way. Secondly, speaking. Now, most of what you say will be informal and casual interactions, and you're good at those. When it comes to formal presentations, though, a couple suggestions. I would say get some training. Take a course in public speaking. Take a course in dealing with the press. There's a specialized way of communicating there. And then take a course in making effective presentations. Then film yourself. Listen to yourself on tape. Look at your posture. Pay attention to all these data points that are really painful. I was sitting in a board meeting a week or so actually it was a little longer ago than that, in New York. It was overcast. It was boring. You could see the reflections of the members of the board in the window. And so I spent my time, rather than listening to what was going on in this meeting, looking at who all the board members were. Until finally I came to one that said, I wonder who that guy is. And I leaned forward, and he did too. And I backed up, and he did too. I did not recognize. Seriously, I had no clue. I was that old. I mean, you do see I promise you, I see myself as your peer. So get help on that, I promise you. Listening. I won't spend a lot of time on this. A lot has been written and said about listening, but there is this thing called capturing in listening, where you do reflective listening, where you really don't try to make a point. My wife and I have gone through this a number of times and talk about a painful experience. When you can't say anything for 15 minutes, your job is to capture. Seek out others' views. Look for negative feedback. Reward it. Be happy and spend 20% of your time listening. Now, that doesn't necessarily need to be with your team, but with customers or whatever. Really spend a chunk of your time as a leader listening, getting input. And that takes a lot of discipline to do that. Okay, this fourth one now is this specialized form of communicating called negotiation. It has its own set of rules, and it often has to do with bargaining and offers and counteroffers, which can either be formal or informal, written or verbal. In negotiating, my advice is to develop a style. You will very rarely be able to change your style midstream in a negotiation. And I would say to you, it even goes further than that. It's hard to change it mid-career. You get a reputation for how you deal with people in this conversation. And some people get a very hardball reputation, and they really are not allowed to abandon it. So like the style that you go into your negotiations with, and by the way, you negotiate with your wife and your children and your boss and your coworkers. You're negotiating all the time. It just depends on the level of formality. Let me suggest one way, and this is only one style, and it doesn't always work, and it's not necessarily better than other styles, but I think a reasonable style to consider is to think about helping the other party achieve their objectives, where your role is to set a price on what it takes to get where they want to go. So all you are is somebody who's making a market in their objectives, and you're really helping them to do that. It's a more pleasant way to do that. And you won't. But by the way, I would not have ended up in litigation had I not adopted that style early on. People would have thought, this is a tough guy. He's not going to fight us. Whereas I really had to change that style and go through many years with trying to establish a new style for a particular event. I would say also, and I know you do that here, but read Getting to Yes and Getting Past No. Those are two really pretty good books that will give you a framework. That get feedback after every negotiation. The best negotiators I've worked with used to huddle with the team afterwards and say, how did we do? How could we have done better? Seek that feedback and refine your negotiations. Wherever possible, use negotiations to build relationships, not just do transactions. And finally, never bluff. I know that's potentially controversial, but that would be it's my last lecture, what the heck. Okay, the last way we communicate is how we behave. And it's, of course, our most potent form of communication. And here, my advice really may surprise you. Don't say or write out values that you're unwilling to live. Dial down the rhetoric to whatever you're willing to live by. Otherwise, what you're going to do is generate a cynicism around you that you won't fully appreciate, perceive maybe, or understand, and you may never overcome it. So make sure that you're behaving consistently with what you're saying in an organization. Okay, the good news about all this communicating stuff is that we can all get a lot better at it. You can practice it, and it's something that you can really work at and become proficient at. The last point that I want to talk about is this one of trust building. This one's tougher, and it is the most critical attribute a leader has. Think about it. If people can't trust you, they really won't follow you to a destination that's other than the one they're going to anyway. Now, there are leaders out there, and I actually worked with one for a number of years, who said that his idea of leadership was finding a parade and getting in front of it. Well, that's one definition of it. If you really want to make a difference, though, let me suggest a handful of ideas. And I'm going to put up this last slide here. We're now talking about being trusted. And there are really sort of three areas. One is how you deal with others. The second is the process. And there are two main processes that will really build trust. And then the third are sort of personal characteristics that you can make sure you have that will dramatically increase how people feel about trusting you. Okay, the first one, and a lot of these I'm going to draw on my own personal experiences, some family-oriented and some business-oriented, so I apologize at the outset for that. The first one, though, in dealing with others, I think these two things are trust other people, even when it costs you. Allow them to make some mistakes, and you need to figure out which ones you're going to allow them to make. But you have to allow people to make some mistakes. And I learned this personally when I was about 15 years old. I wanted to practice driving our car up and down the driveway. Asked my dad for the keys. He tossed me the keys, and I took off. And I ended up running it off into the ditch, getting it stuck. I went back in sheepishly and handed him the keys. He came out, helped me get it out of the ditch, and then I thought he would take the keys in, and that would be that. He tossed me the keys again. Said, "You might want to stay on the driveway this time." And that has so inspired me throughout my life that he was willing to trust me again after I just blew it. And so when my oldest daughter told me that she wanted to go to a dance with a boy prior to the age that we had set up in our family plan, I said, well, you know kind of how we feel about this, and you know all the reasons for it, and I'm sure you agree with them and everything, but I trust you to make the right decision. And why don't you think about it and then come back and tell me about it? So she went off and thought about it, and I said, well, Rebecca, what did you decide? I'm going to the dance. So I had to live with that. And so you have to decide, which ones to do. The cost of overriding that decision are very high on the trust building. If you want to build trust, you've got to pick those moments where you're going to support people's mistakes. The second one in dealing with others that I think has more mileage than any other is to be everyone's assistant. In other words, see yourself as serving other people in the organization, as subordinate to every need. Anything that needs to be done in the organization, you're there to help happen. There's a book that I read a long, long time ago by Robert Greenleaf called Servant Leadership that I would recommend to any of you who are interested in sort of developing this idea. It turned out to be a career changer for me. I started out my career in France, and over there, I look at Sabine there, none of the office help wanted to learn how to run the telex machine. It was beneath them. And it was certainly beneath all the MBAs and the managers to run the telex machine. So I got out the manuals and read them in French, learned how to run the telex machine, and the secretaries would rely on me to send and receive telexes. And I really was happy to do that. Well, one of the things that happened in doing that was I saw every incoming and every outgoing piece of information. I got really smart about what was happening in the office, and I was able to really do some very good work very early on in my career. The more important message, though, is I really developed a trust relationship up and down that organization. So if you can figure out a way not to be hierarchical in your thinking, but to be the servant of all, you'll read in this book, if you read any of it, about Hermann Hesse's Journey to the East, where he describes Leo, the servant who helps them, who's the Sherpa or whatever. It's a mythical journey, but he's the one who helps the party get to the summit, as it were. When Leo is gone, they don't make it. All these leaders, all these muckety-mucks don't make it without the servant, and that's the metaphor. So I think those two things, trusting others, allowing you to make mistakes, and then figuring out where there's a need, serving that need, and not being worried about hierarchy. Okay, the second thing then has to do with process, management. There are two main times, 2 points of pain when you can really increase the trust that you have with your organization, and that is managing in times of change and managing in times of adversity. And let me make some comments about each of those, because I promise you, you will deal with both of these. On change. People don't like change, and almost any organization that you go to work for or organize will suffer from change fatigue. As George Will says, most improvements make things worse. When you make a change, and you will, make sure you're moving toward a goal and not away from something that you don't like. In other words, figure out what it is you want to achieve and move then. Don't just move because you want to get away from something. Make changes sooner than later. I remember one time being excited to build a home and showing the plans to one of my partners who had built secondary recreational houses. And he looked at it, and I was ready to sign the contract and get going with the architect, and I really wanted to get going. I didn't want to change anything in the plans. He looked at them and he said, if you build this way, these ceilings will always be at 8 feet. Well, that's so obvious. But if you think about it, the ceilings will always be at 8 feet. There's some things that if you intervene early, you can, with a sleight of pencil, you can change those ceilings from 8 to 9 to 10 feet if you do it early. If you do it late, they will always be at 8 feet. So make your changes sooner rather than later. When you're making changes, assume that everyone is smart. People, even the dullest people you work with, are pretty smart when it comes to organizational change. So assume people are smart and assume they're volunteers. People have options. All employment is at-will employment, virtually. And just assume that they're smart volunteers. So you need to bring them along. When you present a change for execution, keep it simple. Any of you who've had classes from me have heard me quote my favorite Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who said, "I would not give a fig for the simplicity this side of complexity, but I would give my life for the simplicity the other side of complexity." Problems are complex. Issues are complex. If you stop short of dealing with the complexity, you'll be making simple-minded changes that won't work. If you try to execute at the complex stage, you will fail. You've got to get to the other side of complexity, to that simplicity, in order to be successful. Then, and I've mentioned this to one of my classes, think through the implications of your change. And the screens I run that through are, first of all, what would my lawyer say? Is it legal? Second, would I like it to appear on the front page of the Wall Street Journal? Third, what would I feel like if my neighbor did that to me? And the fourth is the mom test. Could you tell your mom about it? Always do what is right. This will gratify some people and astonish the rest, said Mark Twain. Finally, when you make a change that doesn't work, admit it, take the blame, and move on. Okay, now dealing with adversity, which is the other point of real trust-building opportunity. When the chips are down, you really will build trust. And I'm going to give you a couple of... The most important thing to say here from my experience is to prepare for adversity. You will face it. I don't know when in your life. I thought I would never see it, and then it all hit. And when you're in a firefight, you don't know how you'll react. You don't know when you're overrun where the bullets will be coming from. And you really don't know, so prepare for it. And let me give you several suggestions on preparing for adversity. The first one is to expect to feel bad. You're going to feel a certain level of panic or depression when bad things happen, especially you all. You are batting close to 1,000 in your lives. I mean, you really have had this unbroken string of successes, and you don't really know what this feels like. So you're going to feel maybe more panic than some people who've run into a few more brick walls. You'll be less tempted to give in to any ill wind that blows if you expect the feeling of depression or panic. Knowing that you'll get a second wind, and you have to know this, just like any of you who are runners, it actually happens. You do get a second wind. You will get a second wind, and that'll allow you to survive the initial waves of exhaustion, panic, despair, whatever, and to then succumb to the worst that's in you. Having the equanimity to know that this too will pass is a really powerful thing to develop. I want you each to take 1 second and think about the most embarrassing thing that has ever happened in your life. You've all at least had those. Well, see, I don't see any red faces. I don't see anybody crying, getting up to leave the room. You know, that passed. All these things pass. And so if you know that, that is a really powerful place to start with dealing with adversity. Secondly is don't waste any time or energy on blame when things go wrong. As analytical people, you have a proclivity to go in and figure out what went wrong because you're good at that. When you're good with a hammer, you think everything is a nail. So that's Mark Twain too. So you want to, you really don't want to spend time and energy. Adversity's wounds can be self-inflicted, other-inflicted, environmentally inflicted. Others can do us harm. Bad stuff happens routinely. Life isn't fair. Any time you spend on that will take away from time you could spend on what you do to deal with adversity. I'm going to skip this next one in the interest of time. And I'll just mention this one is to stockpile good memories that you will draw down on. I won't give you examples. Generate a specific backup plan, and I would say, deal with issues like finances, health care, education, child care. Create a safe harbor, in other words, for yourself, a safe place to go in anticipation of that. And taking care of your health, your relationships, and work, while that's hard to do, it's a lot easier to maintain it than it is to rebuild it when it's gone. So make sure those are solid. And then finally, the last thing I would say is do not fear conflict in times of adversity. There will be conflict. You have to know that that's a big part of adversity. Embrace it. As odd as that seems, people around you need you to be a warrior. They need you to be undaunted. They need you to be fearless, and to take on the tasks ahead with some courage. Do, however, avoid litigation. And if you can't avoid it, win. All right, personal characteristics. So those are the 2 points of highest impact in dealing with, in managing situations that will lead to trust. Now the 3 that I would like to mention that are personal characteristics that will increase people's willingness to trust you. The first is to laugh at yourself. People will like you more if you can laugh at yourself and poke fun at your mistakes. I promise you, they will be laughing at you. So you might as well beat them to the punch. And I've got some great examples there, but we're out of time, so I am so lucky to miss telling you that. The second thing is to be open and to look at alternatives. And the best way I like to think about this is as a pilot. You're flying over the terrain that you're leading. Think about flying at strafing level, which is right at the ground, and flying at 30,000 feet, where you really are seeing. And you have to, as a leader, be open to both of those. You have to triangulate on problems. And I've got also a great personal story there that I'll skip over. But I'll tell one of my the S355 class one of these times when I run out of stuff there. Finally, be optimistic. And I know that may sound kind of like there's nothing to be optimistic about necessarily in the world. Choose to be optimistic. Good stuff happens, bad stuff happens. Choose to be optimistic. People are more likely to trust you. See discouragement as temporary. And I will tell you a lesson here because it was so powerfully learned. I just moved out to the West Coast. I was dealing with the departure of our most successful operation. We had just had our little son had been attacked by a dog and had to have plastic surgery. I was in the midst of negotiations with a very difficult partner, very difficult situation. I'd just gotten word that my father had passed away. We were living in a house that was under construction. Our sixth child had been born. And I got home, and the only way we could wash dishes was in the bathtub. It was the only place to wash dishes. And I remember getting home that night and saying, well, can I help you with the dishes? And my wife saying, well, actually, the bathtub is plugged up. Could you take them out on the lawn and wash them off with the garden hose? And I thought, is there anything else? And then I started thinking, I still have my friends. I still have my family. I have my faith. I have my freedom. I have what I've learned. I have my experiences. Nothing that's really important is at peril. So I am going to be optimistic. And I've remembered that several times. And I want to quote Winston Churchill, who went to a prep school in the darkest days of World War II and met with the young students there. And he warned them not to speak of darker days, but of sterner ones. These are not dark days. These are great days, the greatest days our country has ever lived. We must all thank God we've been allowed, each of us according to our stations, to play a part in making these days memorable in history. Well, I've done a good job of filling up the time so there's no time for questions. So let me just finish then by saying that I am really so confident that you all will make this world a much better place for being here, and that through your leadership and your good hearts, you will make a difference. I'm also confident that you'll find happiness through becoming the person that you can be and want to be, and discovering who that person is, through finding and providing love and care in life, and finding a work to which you'll devote your very considerable talents and energies. Thank you.